Imagine finding out the foundation of the modern global economy was built on basically a series of bad math and fabricated startup pitch decks.
I mean, it sounds like modern Silicon Valley, but we're actually talking about the 1400s.
Right. Today, our mission is to unpack the messy, sometimes disastrous, but undeniably fascinating origins of the modern globalized world.
It's a huge topic, and it really recontextualizes how we got to where we are today.
Since we're digging into history today, I'll play the curious student, and you can be the lecturer guiding us through.
I happily accept that role. And to get us started, we are going to be looking closely at Section 2.1 of Chapter 2 from U.S. history.
Awesome.
So the 1400s really kicked off this era of aggressive European expansion. But interestingly, the nation that provided the initial blueprint for this, it wasn't Spain or England.
No, it was Portugal, right?
Exactly, Portugal, under Prince Henry the Navigator.
Reading through Section 2.1, I was struck by how their approach entirely counterintuitive.
How so?
You typically picture empires expanding by, marching massive armies inland to conquer huge amounts of territory. But the Portuguese didn't do that at all.
No, they didn't. Invading massive, populated inland territories in Africa or Asia at that time would have been militarily disastrous.
It's too many people, too much land.
Right, and logistically impossible for a small nation like Portugal. So instead, they focused on the science of strategic navigation.
Okay, so sticking to the coasts.
Exactly. They began by colonizing key Atlantic islands, the Canaries, Cape Verde, the Azores, Madeira.
And they needed those because of the ocean currents, right?
Yes, navigating the complex wind patterns of the Atlantic required safe harbors. They needed those islands as maritime staging grounds to resupply.
That makes sense.
From there, they set up a vast network of coastal trading posts down the western coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope into India, and eventually all the way to China and Japan.
Looking at how they spaced out these ports, it feels less like traditional empire building and more like a modern franchise model.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Or like a series of strategic highway rest stops. I mean, they weren't trying to own the entire state. They just wanted to own every single gas station along the highway so they could control the traffic and, take a cut of the trade.
That is exactly it. They were optimizing for flow, not acreage. By monopolizing those nautical choke points, they held unrivaled control over trade routes.
And they avoided the staggering cost of governing immense land masses.
Right. And this highly efficient model brought them immense wealth. But the mechanics of that wealth quickly took a horrific turn.
Yeah, this is where the story gets really dark.
It does. As Portuguese traders moved down the West African coast, they encountered the existing African slave trade.
And they saw an opportunity.
They realized how this labor could solve a major problem they had just created for themselves.
Which ties back to those Atlantic islands they colonized. Because the textbook points out they had started growing sugar on those islands.
Yes, and sugar is an exceptionally demanding crop.
It's just constant work, right?
Backbreaking, continuous labor to plant, harvest, and refine before it spoils. So to maximize the profitability of these island plantations, the Portuguese began exporting enslaved Africans to provide that labor.
It's just devastating. And the textbook includes an image of Elmina Castle in present-day Ghana, which was built by the Portuguese in 1482.
Yes, the architecture of that place is so telling.
The details tell such a dark story, because you would assume a European fort on the coast of Africa would have its cannons pointed inland, to defend against attacks from the continent.
But they don't.
Right. The cannons at Elmina are pointed out to the sea.
Because the Portuguese were far more terrified of a naval attack from heavily armed rival Europeans trying to steal their wealth.
They weren't worried about the local populations?
Not in the same way, no. At that stage, they were largely leasing or negotiating the rights to these coastal outposts with powerful local African rulers. Their primary threat vector was naval piracy from their own neighbors. Wow. And Elmina Castle perfectly encapsulates the evolution of this whole era. It was originally built as a fortified post for trading gold.
Which is where the name comes from, right?
Right.
From the Portuguese word for the mine.
Exactly. But by the 16th century, the economic focus had shifted entirely away from gold and on to human capital.
The textbook mentions how the dungeons beneath the castle were converted into literal holding pens.
Yes.
Captured people from the interior of the continent were brought there and held, sometimes for months, in absolute darkness.
The conditions were unimaginable.
The psychological horror of that is hard to fathom, especially knowing that the Portuguese traders were eating, sleeping, and praying in a chapel on the upper floors directly above them.
It's a stark physical representation of the cruelty of the trade.
And for the enslaved people in those dungeons, Elmina Castle was their final site of their home continent before being forced onto ships across the Atlantic.
That insatiable European demand for sugar really fueled this gargantuan plantation complex that would eventually alter global demographics.
It was basically the mechanical beginning of the transatlantic slave trade as we know it.
It was. So with Portugal building this incredibly lucrative global network of trade posts, monopolizing gold, sugar, and the slave trade.
Spain is sitting right next door on the Iberian Peninsula. I imagine the Spanish crown was looking across the border with intense envy.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
They were desperate to compete, but Spain had a massive domestic bottleneck to clear first.
They had to get their own house in order.
They had to achieve unification. For centuries, the Iberian Peninsula had been divided, with much of it under Islamic rule.
Right, the Moors.
Yes. But in 1469, King Ferdinand of Aragon and Queen Isabella of Castile married, unifying Catholic Spain.
And they spent the next several decades heavily invested in the Reconquista, right? This holy war to defeat the last Islamic stronghold in Granada.
Exactly.
And they finally complete that conquest in 1492. So generations of holy war created a highly militarized society.
Yes, very accustomed to conflict and conquest.
Suddenly, Ferdinand and Isabella have this unified, heavily armed country. The war at home is over, and they need a new outlet for that ambition.
They needed to catch up to Portugal commercially, and they also deeply wanted to expand Catholicism globally.
So it's this massive geopolitical pressure cooker.
Which is exactly what sets the stage for Christopher Columbus.
Because he happens to offer them a potential shortcut to Asia just when they were most desperate for one.
Precisely.
You know, the textbook's details on Columbus really dismantle the mythology we usually hear.
You really do.
Like, first of all, he was an Italian from Genoa, and starting around 1485, he spent years pitching his idea to sail west to reach India.
He went everywhere.
Yeah, he went to Venice, to Portugal, to England, and initially to Spain, basically begging monarchs to fund his expedition, and they all rejected him.
And it wasn't because they thought the Earth was flat.
Right. That's the biggest myth. The nautical experts of the day knew the Earth was a sphere.
Scholars had known the Earth was round for centuries. Mathematicians actually had a surprisingly accurate estimate of its circumference.
So they knew how big the ocean was.
The experts advising these monarchs knew the ocean separating Europe from Asia was roughly 10,000 miles across.
But Columbus, however, aggressively insisted on flawed calculations.
Yes, he believed the Earth was vastly smaller than it actually is. He estimated the distance to Asia to be only a few thousand miles.
So he was essentially a guy pitching a mathematically impossible business model.
That's a great way to frame it.
The experts knew that if a crew sailed west, based on Columbus's math, they would starve to death in the middle of a massive ocean long before they ever hit Asia.
Exactly. Ferdinand and Isabella knew the math was highly suspect too.
So why did they fund him?
Because by 1492, Portugal was on the verge of reaching Asia by sailing around the southern tip of Africa.
Ah, so it was FOMO.
Completely. The Spanish monarchs took a calculated gamble fueled by the fear of missing out. They gave Columbus 3 ships.
And because of his erroneous views on the size of the globe, when he made landfall in the Bahamas and later to Hispaniola, he fully expected to have arrived in the East Indies.
Which perfectly explains why he called the native Taino people Indios.
Right. An entire linguistic legacy, the term Indian for native peoples of the Americas, was born entirely out of Columbus being historically bad at geography.
It really was. So after making landfall, Columbus writes a letter back to the Spanish crown in 1493.
And the textbook refers to this document as a probanza de merito, a proof of merit.
Yes. Historians look at these primary sources very carefully to distinguish factual reporting from biased motivation.
Well, reading the excerpts of this letter in section 2.1, it is uncanny how much it reads like a modern startup pitch deck.
Oh, it really does.
It feels like a founder sending a highly exaggerated, cherry-picked presentation to their venture capitalists, designed specifically to secure a second round of funding.
Columbus knew exactly which metrics to inflate to get his investors to open their royal wallets.
He had to make it sound like a sure thing.
A probanza de merito was a promotional tool. Columbus had to justify the initial investment and prove that a return was imminent, even though he hadn't actually found the Asian spice markets he promised.
The language he uses is pure marketing. He claims the land has ports excelling any in Christendom.
Classic exaggeration.
He talks up endless mines of gold and spices. And he also describes the native people in a very specific, deliberate way, calling them extraordinarily timid and claiming their only weapons are sharpened sticks of cane that they're too afraid to use.
He was fabricating a narrative of passive natives and abundant, unguarded wealth.
Just sitting there waiting to be taken.
Right. Publishing this propaganda created a highly dangerous myth for European readers. It convinced an entire generation that conquering this new world would be frictionless and absurdly lucrative.
It embedded a narrative of European supremacy and Native American timidity that was entirely based on self-aggrandizing marketing rather than reality.
And that marketing campaign worked almost too well. It triggered a massive land rush.
Putting Spain and Portugal on the brink of an all-out war over this new territory.
Exactly. The geopolitical panic caused by Columbus's claims forced the Spanish-born Pope Alexander VI to intervene.
Right, the Pope has to step in to stop two Catholic powers from fighting.
To prevent a war, he brokered the Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494. They basically took a map of the world and drew a little north-south line through South America.
The textbook features the 1502 Cantino world map depicting this exact division.
Fascinating to look at.
The Pope decrees that Spain gets all the territory west of the line and Portugal gets everything east of it.
And because that line sliced right through the eastern edge of South America, Portugal claimed the territory that eventually became Brazil.
Which is the exact historical mechanism explaining why Brazil speaks Portuguese today, while the rest of the continent primarily speaks Spanish.
Yes. Portugal was content with this because it secured their established, highly profitable route around Africa to India.
They already had a good thing going.
But Spain, however, was handed an unknown western landmass. To justify the immense cost of exploration and the geopolitical maneuvering of the treaty, Spain needed to extract the massive wealth Columbus had promised in his letters.
And this urgency is what unleashes the era of the conquistadors.
Exactly.
The most famous case study from the textbook is Hernán Cortés arriving in Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire, in 1519.
Yes.
And the traditional simplified narrative frames this as a few hundred superior Europeans effortlessly conquering a savage empire. But Section 2.1 makes it incredibly clear that this is a complete myth.
A total fabrication.
Cortés didn't just walk in and overpower the Aztecs with superior weapons.
Not at all. The reality of the conquest relied on three complex biological and political mechanisms, none of which were simple European military supremacy.
Let's break those down. What was the first factor?
The first factor was severe internal disunity and strategic alliances.
Among the native populations?
Yes. The Aztec Empire was vast, and many subject groups deeply resented Aztec rule and the heavy tributes extracted from them.
So Cortés recognized this fracture and weaponized it.
He did.
Yeah.
He recruited massive indigenous armies to fight alongside the Spanish. Groups like the Tlaxcalan provided as many as 200,000 fighters during the siege of Tenochtitlan.
Wow, 200,000. So it was essentially a massive indigenous civil war that the Spanish opportunistically co-opted.
Exactly.
A few hundred Spaniards with crude muskets didn't conquer the city. A coalition army of hundreds of thousands of native fighters did.
Correct. The second, and perhaps most devastating mechanism, was biological.
Disease.
Yes. The Spanish inadvertently introduced smallpox into the Valley of Mexico.
And because the native populations had been biologically isolated from Europe for millennia, they had absolutely zero immunity to the pathogen.
The disease decimated the population of Tenochtitlan, completely paralyzing their ability to defend the city.
The textbook notes that this microscopic virus played a much greater role in the empire's collapse than any Spanish sword or cannon.
Without a doubt.
And the third crucial factor the textbook outlines is translation, the ability to bridge the profound linguistic and cultural gaps.
This centers around a figure named Melanson, also known as Lama Lynch.
The textbook presents her as a deeply controversial historical figure. Her legacy is viewed in very different lights, depending on who you ask.
Yes. Section 2.1 handles her history very carefully, as it should. Melanson was a Nahua woman given to Cortés as tribute.
And she possessed a remarkable linguistic ability, right?
She did. She acted as his translator in his dealings with the Aztec ruler Moctezuma and other indigenous leaders.
The text notes that some view her as a traitor who actively aided the destruction of her own people.
While others view her as a tragic victim of European expansion, a woman forced into an impossible situation who used her skills to survive.
It also mentions she entered into a physical relationship with Cortez, and their son, Martin, is considered the first mestizo, a person of mixed indigenous American and European descent.
Right. And regardless of the moral judgments placed on her, historically speaking, her ability to translate was the operational linchpin for the Spanish.
Because without her navigating the complex political landscape, Cortez would have been entirely blind.
He wouldn't have been able to communicate or form those crucial 200,000-man alliances. Her role really underscores how native peoples themselves, operating under intense pressure, shaped the mechanics of the conquest.
So Cortez strikes it rich, conquers Tenochtitlan, and renames it Mexico City.
Yes.
But reading about the subsequent explorers in the textbook, it becomes obvious that Cortez was the exception.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, did any of the others find that kind of wealth? Because the rest of the conquistadors seem to have bought into Columbus's exaggerated marketing, wandered into the continent, and died broke.
Well, no, definitely not. The textbook chronicles a string of highly ambitious, disastrous failures. For example, Francisco Pizarro successfully conquered the Inca Empire in Peru in the 1530s, but the immense wealth destabilized the Spanish ranks, and Pizarro was actually assassinated by a rival Spanish faction fighting over the loot.
Wow. And then there was Hernando de Soto, who led an expedition through the southeastern United States.
Tracking through Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Texas.
And he spent years wandering, spreading European diseases that devastated local populations, only to die of disease himself in 1542.
His surviving men limped back to Mexico City completely bankrupt, having found none of the mythical golden cities they were promised.
And Francisco Vázquez de Coronado experienced a very similar reality.
He went bankrupt, searching the American Southwest for a mythical golden city called Quivira.
The textbook includes a map of Coronado's route through places like New Mexico and Kansas, and I love that it explicitly highlights the political reality of the landscape.
Because it wasn't an empty wilderness.
Exactly. This wasn't an empty wilderness waiting for European discovery. The map names the Apache, the Navajo, the Hopi, the Comanche.
These were complex, highly populated territories controlled by powerful indigenous groups.
Coronado was essentially wandering through sovereign nations, sparking conflicts, and bleeding his own expedition dry.
It thoroughly shatters the myth of the untouched continent.
It really does.
But despite the failures of De Soto and Coronado, the sheer volume of gold and silver that did get successfully extracted from places like Mexico and Peru had a profound macroeconomic impact.
Where did all that money go?
That wealth flowed directly back across the Atlantic and fueled the Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age.
So under the Habsburg dynasty, the staggering wealth extracted from the Americas was weaponized to finance a massive cultural boom in Renaissance art, literature, music, and architecture.
It's a brutal historical paradox: extreme human suffering and extraction funding enduring beauty.
The textbook highlights two specific cultural touchstones from this era that I think perfectly capture the psychology of the time.
The literature and art of the Golden Age tell us exactly how the Spanish viewed themselves and their sudden influx of global power.
The first one is Miguel de Cervantes' novel, Don Quixote.
A classic.
Right. It's the story of an hidalgo, a gentleman who reads so many fictional tales of chivalry and knighthood that he literally loses touch with reality. He rides out into the countryside trying to fight imaginary enemies.
And the parallel to the conquistadors is stunning.
You have a whole generation of European men reading those exaggerated, fictionalized probanzas de Merito tales of golden cities and easy conquests in the New World.
They lose touch with reality, wander into the American Southwest like Don Quixote, fight imaginary enemies, and bankrupt themselves chasing a fantasy.
It's incredible. The cultural delusion fueled by those early marketing pitches was perfectly mirrored in the era's most famous literature.
And that wealth also revolutionized visual art.
Like Diego Velázquez's 1656 painting, Las Meninas. It's this massive, imposing royal portrait.
And Velázquez audaciously paints himself into the picture, standing on the left holding his brush.
But the structural genius of the painting is the perspective. He constructs the scene so that you, the viewer looking at the painting, are standing in the exact physical space where the king and queen of Spain would be standing.
It forces the viewer to inhabit the perspective of the monarchs. You are placed in the shoes of the people benefiting from this unprecedented global wealth, looking back at the court it financed.
That is just brilliant.
Synthesizing all of this material from the textbook, we are really looking at the mechanical birth of globalization.
The good and the horrific.
Yes, the enduring art of the Spanish Renaissance and the vast, interconnected supply chains we live with today were directly financed by a ruthless era of territorial conquest.
A system built on bad math, fueled by fabricated marketing, driven by the extraction of indigenous wealth, and stabilized by the horrific mechanics of the transatlantic slave trade.
It completely recontextualizes the foundations of the modern world.
It really does. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you, our listener, to mull over on your own.
Go for it.
If Columbus's Probanza de Merito was essentially just a fabricated pitch deck designed to secure royal venture capital, how many other foundational stories from human history are actually just the surviving copies of early marketing campaigns?
That is something to carefully consider next time you read a primary source. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.